You know, they don't pay very much for military, and the reason they don't pay much is they assume that we're going to protect them. They have a very small military. They rely on our military. We basically protect Canada.
We've made major investments in defense in recent months. We're committed to accelerating that.
He looks to build new security relationships that are outside of our relationship with the U.S.
Some other countries are also reviewing their contracts to buy these very expensive fighter jets from the U.S. over trade concerns.
Mark Carney is committed to hitting the NATO 2% of GDP on defense spending target.
They've committed to make more in Canada.
Breaking news. Donald Trump is in a rage as America's skies are thrown into turmoil. Canada has just seized a massive fighter jet contract once bound for U.S. manufacturers, leaving the Pentagon blindsided and scrambling. From Washington to Detroit, shockwaves are tearing through America's defense industry tonight. Just weeks ago, President Donald Trump stood at the podium in Washington vowing to defend American workers and shield the nation's defense industry from foreign competition. He promised tariffs, contracts, and policies designed to keep U.S. jobs in American hands. From the steel mills of Pennsylvania to the aerospace hubs of Seattle and Fort Worth, the message was clear: America first. But trade wars have consequences. After months of escalating tariffs, stalled negotiations, and repeated threats, Canada has struck back with a stunning maneuver, claiming the very fighter jet contracts once seen as untouchable symbols of U.S. military supremacy. Before we go on, hit the like button and subscribe. It's the simplest way to support the channel, and you won't want to miss what's coming up next. Let's dive in. In Ottawa, the announcement landed like a thunderclap. Canada has formally awarded billions of dollars in next-generation fighter jet contracts to a coalition of European manufacturers, effectively freezing out the United States for the first time in decades. These contracts, long expected to flow to American firms in St. Louis, Fort Worth, and Seattle, will instead see Canadian pilots flying aircraft assembled in Montreal, with engines sourced from European partners and electronics supplied by Asia. Washington insiders described the decision as a direct response to Trump's sweeping tariff policy, which had targeted Canadian aluminum, steel, and aerospace components over the past year. What makes this move even more jarring is its timing. For months, the Pentagon had counted on Canadian orders to keep production lines humming at Boeing and Lockheed Martin. Instead, Canada's Defense Ministry declared it would pivot to secure supply chains beyond American politics. In plain terms, a critical U.S. ally has just cut America's defense giants out of the deal, choosing independence over dependency. Analysts warn the loss amounts to more than contracts. It's a rupture in North America's defense economy, with shockwaves reaching deep into U.S. cities that depend on aerospace jobs. Across America, the fallout is already being felt. In Fort Worth, home to thousands of Lockheed Martin workers, stunned employees gathered outside factory gates this morning as news of Canada's decision spread. What had been a steady flow of orders, expected to keep assembly lines moving through 2030, has suddenly evaporated. Local leaders warn that layoffs are inevitable. "We've built fighters for generations," one worker told reporters, "and now we're being undercut by our closest ally." In St. Louis, where Boeing's defense division anchors the city's economy, the mood is no less grim. Suppliers across Missouri depend on steady Pentagon-backed orders to keep their own shops running. From aluminum plants in the Midwest to avionics firms in California, ripple effects are cascading outward. Analysts estimate that more than 20,000 American jobs could be at risk if Canada's pivot holds, and that figure does not account for the secondary impact on small contractors that feed into the aerospace supply chain. The shock is not just economic, it's symbolic. For decades, the United States has been the undisputed source of high-end fighter jets for NATO allies. F-16s, F-A-18s, and now the F-35 have long been viewed as the backbone of Western air power. To see Ottawa openly turn away from American suppliers and toward a patchwork of European and Asian alternatives is a blow to U.S. prestige as much as to its economy. The Pentagon itself, according to insiders, was caught flat-footed. Officials had expected routine negotiations, not a sweeping rejection of American contracts. The emotional punch is compounded by geography. Many of the hardest-hit states are politically pivotal. Texas, Missouri, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are all bracing for layoffs, wage freezes, and shrinking tax bases. Local politicians, mayors, and governors are already demanding answers from Washington. How could America's closest ally suddenly cut the cord? And why wasn't the White House prepared? Economists point out that this isn't just about fighter jets. Aerospace is one of America's few industries where exports still dominate global markets. Each lost contract chips away at that advantage. If other allies follow Canada's lead, Washington could face a domino effect, where countries from Australia to Poland begin shopping elsewhere for their next-generation fleets. That would mean more lost orders, more lost jobs, and a shrinking share of a market once considered untouchable. At the consumer level, the shift is likely to drive up costs. With fewer production orders, per-unit expenses for remaining jets rise, forcing the Pentagon to pay more per plane. Taxpayers ultimately foot the bill. Meanwhile, Canada and its European partners are promising cheaper alternatives, potentially creating a two-tiered defense market, one where allies pay less for aircraft that don't bear a Made in America stamp. That dynamic could accelerate the erosion of U.S. dominance in military exports. Perhaps most striking is the psychological blow. For generations, Americans have been told that their defense industry is the envy of the world. From the Wright brothers to the stealth bomber, the United States has led the way in aviation. To watch Canada, one of America's closest allies, openly walk away undermines that narrative. It raises uncomfortable questions about whether tariffs and trade wars are strengthening or weakening the very industries they were meant to protect. Inside the Pentagon, frustration is boiling over. Senior officials reportedly warned months ago that tariff battles could alienate allies, making it harder to maintain defense partnerships. Their warnings, sources say, were brushed aside in favor of hardline rhetoric. Now, with contracts gone and jobs on the line, those warnings look prophetic. "We didn't just lose business," one defense analyst said. "We lost trust." It's a story that stretches far beyond numbers on a balance sheet. These are families, neighborhoods, and entire towns caught in the crossfire of international trade politics. When Canada pulls the plug on billions in U.S. defense contracts, it's not just the Pentagon that feels the pain. It's the diner waitress serving coffee to laid-off machinists in Missouri, the school district in Texas losing tax revenue, the small business in Detroit wondering how to survive another downturn. This is the impact on the United States: immediate, widespread, and deeply personal. And unless Washington finds a way to reverse course, America's workers may discover that the jobs they were promised protection for have become the very first casualties of a trade war gone wrong. Canada's decision to seize these contracts is not an isolated procurement move. It's a recalibration of power that reaches well beyond Ottawa or Washington. For decades, America's defense sector has operated with the unspoken assumption that its closest allies would buy American as a matter of both trust and necessity. Fighter jets were not just hardware, they were extensions of U.S. influence, anchors of NATO unity, and symbols of Washington's industrial supremacy. That framework is now cracking. What makes this rupture so striking is the scale of the prize. Fighter jets are not lumber or wheat. They are strategic assets that intertwine with sovereignty and security. By turning to European manufacturers and by making clear that the decision was a reaction to tariffs and trade strain, Canada is signaling that the old rules no longer apply. Even allies that share America's borders and defense treaties are willing to diversify if Washington's policies become too unpredictable. That message will not be lost on capitals in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East. The broader economic impact begins with markets. Aerospace is one of America's few remaining sectors where exports reliably outweigh imports, generating billions annually and supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs across multiple states. Every contract lost to a competitor country chips away at that advantage. With Canada redirecting its procurement, analysts warn that European suppliers could gain a foothold in markets once dominated by U.S. firms. Countries like Germany, France, and even South Korea are closely watching the Canadian shift. If Ottawa can successfully fly fleets without American jets, others may follow suit. The ripple effects extend further into supply chains. Fighter jet production is not a single factory endeavor. It draws on metals from Pennsylvania, electronics from California, composites from Kansas, and engines from Ohio. When a contract evaporates, each of these regions loses leverage. It also sends a powerful signal to the global supply network. America's defense exports are no longer a guaranteed anchor. In practical terms, this means European and Asian firms can begin negotiating from a stronger position, demanding better terms or larger shares of the global market. Over time, Washington's dominance could erode from structural reliance to competitive parity. Another layer of consequence is found in the global perception of U.S. political reliability. Trump's tariff battles were framed as tools to safeguard American workers. Yet from abroad, they are increasingly seen as destabilizing instruments that can ensnare allies as easily as rivals. Canada's move demonstrates that even the most integrated partners are seeking insulation from American volatility. This perception matters because it shapes future deals. Nations deciding on long-term defense partnerships weigh not only cost and capability, but also the predictability of supply. If Washington is viewed as unpredictable, doors open wider for others. Economists also point to the cascading effects on commodity markets. Fighter jets require titanium, aluminum, rare earth elements, and specialized composites. Canada's pivot to non-American suppliers redirects demand for those resources. Mines in Australia, electronics factories in South Korea, and smelters in Scandinavia stand to gain. Meanwhile, American producers face the prospect of overcapacity and declining orders. This redistribution of demand may not sound dramatic on paper, but it compounds over time, shaping where industries expand, where new mines open, and which countries lock in long-term technological leadership. The strategic shock reaches into Asia as well. Nations like Japan and South Korea have long relied on U.S. fighters as the backbone of their defense. But Canada's diversification shows that alternatives exist. European fighters like the Eurofighter Typhoon or Sweden's Gripen, while historically considered secondary, gain credibility when adopted by a NATO member in good standing. If Ottawa can integrate those platforms effectively, Asian allies may see justification to hedge their bets. That shift could ripple back into U.S. strategy, complicating Washington's efforts to maintain cohesive fleets among its allies. From a purely financial perspective, the numbers are sobering. Analysts estimate that Canada's redirection of contracts represents tens of billions in potential lost revenue for American firms over the coming decade. But the true cost lies in momentum. Aerospace innovation thrives on large orders that justify investment in next-generation technologies. Without steady streams of allied contracts, U.S. firms may struggle to fund breakthroughs at the pace required. Meanwhile, European competitors, buoyed by new deals, can pour resources into upgrades, narrowing the technological gap that has long separated them from American industry. The global defense marketplace is notoriously competitive. Export orders often shape domestic political debates, with leaders touting jobs created and influence secured. Canada's move flips this narrative on its head. Instead of Washington claiming a victory for American jobs, it is Ottawa delivering contracts to non-U.S. firms and doing so explicitly as a pushback against tariffs. That sets a precedent. If other allies perceive that distancing from U.S. suppliers brings both economic and political breathing room, they may be emboldened to follow Canada's example. The result could be a slow-motion erosion of the defense industrial ecosystem that has underpinned U.S. power projection for decades. Perhaps the most consequential dimension is psychological. America's identity as the arsenal of democracy is deeply ingrained. From World War II through the Cold War and into the 21st century, U.S. factories armed not only American forces but also much of the free world. Fighter jets, in particular, carried a symbolic weight far beyond their wingspan. To see a neighbor and ally reject that legacy, openly and in favor of alternatives, strikes at the heart of American confidence. For policymakers in Washington, the sting is more than financial. It is existential. Beyond the immediate headlines, the strategic shockwaves reverberate into the broader architecture of global security. When Canada sidesteps U.S. aerospace, it does more than alter one procurement list. It demonstrates that the gravitational pull of America's defense industry is weakening, and that allies are ready to test alternatives. That perception carries immense weight in capitals from Berlin to Tokyo. Defense procurement is not just commerce, it is diplomacy by another name. And diplomacy, once altered, rarely reverts to its old patterns. The most direct geopolitical beneficiary of Canada's decision may be Europe. With contracts flowing to European firms, the continent gains leverage within NATO. For decades, Washington held not just political dominance but industrial dominance inside the alliance. European members often bought American aircraft, even when homegrown options existed, because U.S. platforms promised interoperability and political favor. Now Ottawa has broken that tradition, and in doing so, it gives European defense leaders a rallying point. They can argue that NATO's future does not require unquestioned reliance on American arms. That subtle shift could rebalance the alliance, giving Brussels and Berlin more say in both procurement and policy. Asian markets are watching closely as well. Japan, South Korea, and Australia each maintain close defense ties with Washington, yet each has faced turbulence in recent years tied to tariffs, supply delays, or shifting U.S. priorities. Canada's pivot provides a blueprint: diversify, hedge, and reduce dependence on the politics of one capital. If even a handful of U.S. allies pursue similar strategies, America's defense industrial advantage could erode at an accelerating pace. Over decades, that might translate into a world where Washington is one supplier among many, rather than the default source of cutting-edge systems. Economists warn of broader macroeconomic risks. Defense exports are one of the few areas where the United States consistently runs surpluses. Losing even a portion of that edge weakens the balance of trade, erodes the dollar's advantage, and narrows the fiscal space Washington has traditionally used to fund global power projection. Put plainly, fewer exports mean less revenue, which means less capacity to sustain the vast network of bases, fleets, and operations that underpin American influence. In that sense, Canada's decision is not just a procurement choice, but a quiet strike at the foundations of U.S. global presence. From Washington's perspective, the danger is not just economic, but strategic. For years, the Pentagon has pursued a doctrine of interoperability, ensuring that allied forces fly, sail, and fight with U.S. systems to guarantee seamless coordination. That doctrine depends on allies choosing American equipment. If Canada integrates European fighters into its fleet, the long-term result could be divergence in training, maintenance, and joint operations. Interoperability, once taken for granted, could fray. That makes collective defense more complicated and undermines Washington's ability to lead in crises. Domestically, the political fallout is already building. Lawmakers from Texas, Missouri, and Washington state are sounding alarms, warning that America's industrial heartland is once again at risk of hollowing out. Their concerns are not purely local. If factories close or contracts shift abroad, America loses not only jobs but also the skilled workforce that sustains technological leadership. Aerospace is not an industry that can be rebuilt quickly once lost. Each machinist, engineer, and technician represents years of experience. If demand collapses, that talent disperses, and regaining it later becomes nearly impossible. Critically, this is not a short-term standoff that can be smoothed over with one phone call or one negotiation. Canada's choice reflects a structural calculation that relying too heavily on the U.S. is a liability in an era of trade wars and tariffs. Unless Washington reverses course on its broader economic strategy, the precedent set here could spread. Nations will not forget that a NATO partner chose independence over tradition, and they may prepare their own contingency plans accordingly. Some analysts argue that this moment could mark the start of a multipolar defense economy. For most of the post-war era, the United States stood atop the pyramid, with Europe and Asia feeding into its orbit. Now, contracts and alliances are branching outward, forming a web rather than a hierarchy. In such a world, Washington's influence depends not on inevitability, but on persuasion. That requires trust, predictability, and consistency, traits that have been eroded by years of tariff battles and shifting rhetoric. In the long run, the economic costs may be overshadowed by the symbolic ones. Losing a contract here or there may seem manageable, but when the narrative hardens, that allies can and will thrive without American aircraft, the psychological barrier breaks. Once broken, it is difficult to rebuild. Washington risks becoming just another bidder rather than the default supplier. And for a nation whose identity has long been entwined with the role of global arsenal, that transition could prove more painful than any tariff, tax, or treaty dispute. The broader geopolitical and economic significance of Canada's decision is therefore twofold. On the surface, it is a blow to U.S. aerospace with immediate costs in jobs, revenue, and prestige. Beneath the surface, it is a shift in the tectonic plates of global power, hinting at a future where America's dominance is no longer assumed. Allies are charting their own paths, markets are redistributing demand, and rivals are watching eagerly. The Pentagon is left not only in shock, but in a new strategic reality, one where loyalty can no longer be taken for granted, and where economic decisions by close neighbors carry consequences that reverberate across oceans. Looking ahead, the trajectory is unmistakable. Canada's decision is not a one-off procurement, but the opening salvo in a longer cycle of economic realignment. For the United States, the question is no longer whether allies will hedge against American suppliers, but how quickly and how deeply they will do so. If Canada can make this pivot, others will take note, from NATO capitals in Europe to treaty allies in Asia. The first stake is economic. U.S. aerospace firms are now under pressure to slash costs or risk being priced out of allied markets. Analysts warn that future contracts in countries like Poland, Australia, and even Japan may no longer be guaranteed for American manufacturers. If those orders shift toward European or joint consortiums, U.S. firms face shrinking economies of scale. That means higher costs per aircraft, reduced profitability, and a dangerous feedback loop. Fewer contracts lead to higher prices, which in turn drive more customers away. The Pentagon itself would end up paying more for each jet, placing additional strain on defense budgets already stretched by global commitments. The second stake is industrial. America's aerospace workforce, the welders in Missouri, the engineers in Washington, the machinists in Texas, depends on steady orders to keep skills sharp and production lines viable. If those lines slow, the industrial base atrophies. In a decade, the U.S. could find itself struggling to ramp up production in a crisis, not because of lack of technology, but because of lack of capacity. That erosion of surge potential is what keeps Pentagon planners awake at night. The third stake is geopolitical. Canada's pivot signals to other allies that it is possible to diversify away from American systems without breaking alliance bonds. This precedent matters. If European and Asian nations begin to field mixed fleets, the doctrine of US-led interoperability frays. In practice, that could mean more difficult joint operations, longer integration timelines, and reduced American leverage in alliance decision-making. Washington may still lead on paper, but its ability to dictate the terms of collective defense would be diminished. There are also price consequences for ordinary Americans. Fighter jets are purchased with taxpayer dollars. If U.S. firms lose allied contracts and spread their fixed costs over smaller production runs, the Pentagon pays more per aircraft. Those costs echo back to Congress and ultimately to taxpayers. In short, Americans could end up paying more for fewer planes, while allies fly cheaper alternatives. That dynamic undermines both efficiency and perception, two pillars of U.S. defense leadership. Looking outward, markets are already adjusting. European firms are preparing to leverage Canada's decision as a marketing tool, telling other allies, if Ottawa trusts us, so can you. Asian buyers, long cautious about straying from U.S. suppliers, will quietly explore their options. Even nations outside the U.S. orbit, India, Brazil, and Middle Eastern states, may see an opportunity to extract concessions from Washington by hinting at alternative purchases. Each of these developments chips away at the sense of inevitability that once surrounded American defense exports. Yet the stakes are not unidirectional. Washington still has levers to pull. The U.S. remains the technological leader in stealth, avionics, and integrated weapons systems. If the administration chooses, it could recalibrate, dialing back tariffs, stabilizing supply chains, and offering allies more predictable terms. Doing so would not erase the damage, but it might slow the momentum of diversification. Conversely, doubling down on hardline tariffs and combative rhetoric would only accelerate the exodus. The coming months are critical. Canada's contracts are signed, but their implementation will unfold over years. That leaves space for Washington to respond, through negotiations, incentives, or policy shifts. Whether it seizes that opportunity will determine if this moment becomes a passing setback or the beginning of a structural decline. In the long view, the stakes are about more than contracts or factories. They are about America's role in the world. Is the United States still the indispensable supplier, the arsenal of democracy, the partner whose industrial might underwrites global security? Or is it becoming one of several options, still powerful but no longer preeminent? The answer will shape not only defense markets but also the perception of American leadership itself. For now, the outlook is stark. Unless Washington recalibrates, Canada's decision will be remembered not as an isolated act, but as the moment the world realized America's dominance could be contested, and its closest allies were willing to prove it. The shock out of Ottawa is more than a lost contract. It is a message that even America's closest allies are willing to move past Washington when trade wars turn into strategic risks. From Fort Worth to St. Louis, from Detroit to Seattle, the economic and political aftershocks are only beginning to register. For the Pentagon, the realization is sobering. The arsenal of democracy cannot take loyalty for granted. But this story is far from over. What happens next will depend on Washington's choices, Canada's follow-through, and the reactions of allies watching across the globe. If today's analysis was helpful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. We're following the major developments that impact you, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Stay with us.